So it's a great pleasure, of course, an honor, of course, to host Professor Spolsky here. It's kind of funny to say to host because we've been such good friends and colleagues for so long. And you are here already the first semester for a visit, not for a talk, but to witness the context. Anyway, and I could say so many things about Professor Spolsky, and in a way I thought I'd just kind of summarize it in a few sentences and to say that almost every area in applied linguistics within that area you started, whether it's language policy, whether it's ethical issues of language testing, whether it's issues of multilingualism, whether it's issues of Indian languages, probably not so, but has been around, and a variety of topics that have been prominent in Professor Spolsky's life and work.
Landscape.
Huh?
Linguistic landscape.
Yes, and linguistic landscape as well. So I would say, and in each topic, I think what is so special about your work is that you started it, or you defined it, you argued with it, you redefined it, and wrote a book. So everything that we can talk about, whether it's measured words, which is one way to critique issues of language testing, whether it's language management, which is a new way to think of language policy, whether it's the work that we'll be hearing today, which is all about Jewish languages. And we just had lunch together, and I said, Jewish languages, I never thought you were really interested in that. I mean, I knew Professor Spolsky had interest in language and religion, sure. But between that and doing work on language and religion within the Jewish context, that's something new. So what I really like about your work, and I think for all of us, is that you choose an area, you define an area, and in fact, we talked about it over lunch now, and that is, once you get into the area and you write a book, the book is a journey. And same thing I felt about when we did the book on languages of Israel. Sure, nobody had written a book on language in Israel before, but it's through the book itself and the curiosity that Professor Spolsky has in that area, and the excavating and finding and uncovering so many new documents that nobody had really thought about it before, that you define the whole area for us. And for me, as a person in academia, it's been a pleasure, because I remember still the moment where I'm at the Berkeley campus many years ago, maybe 1983, I think 82, and Andrew Cohen writes to me a letter. Israel is really getting to be very excited because Cooper is here and Bernard Spolsky is here now, and he decided to stay. And I still remember till today my feet kind of trembling a bit and say, oh, Professor Spolsky is in Israel. So that means it's time to go to Israel. And a year later, I was here. So I don't want to say that it's the only reason I came here. There are other reasons as well. But it certainly played a major role in my decision to come here. And I must say, I was really, really privileged, because throughout all my career in this university and wherever I was there, we worked together, not always agreeing on things, oftentimes disagreeing about lots of things, but never failed to have a continued conversation and discussion about it. So I think what we learned working together, we don't agree on things, but you can always continue talking about the issues, because the issues are important. So it's been a privilege for me. I'm sure it's a privilege for you, because all the students sitting here read something of Professor Spolsky, whether it's in language testing, whether it's in second language acquisition, whether it's language policy, and I forgot to mention that you started the journal Language Policy that I and Kendall took over after that. So in all these situations, I think we were really privileged to read your work, to learn from it. And I think today we are going to hear something new, which is about Jewish languages, and it's only one part of a book that's coming out pretty soon. I'm sure you'll talk about it. And without further ado, I'm just saying it was a privilege to all of us, and thank you for coming here all the way from Jerusalem, just to be in this very session. So I think it's also good for you all, and looking forward to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I can say, as you say, when you get to be as old as I am, you probably would have done a lot of stuff too. The other thing I was going to say about in answer to Professor Shohamy, we usually argued very bitterly. She would say something completely crazy. I would say that's stupid and impossible. And 2 days later I'd come and say, actually you were right. So it's been a good relationship. All right. What I want to do is talk about some of the issues that arose in writing my most recent book. I should finish the index by the end of the month and send it off to Cambridge, and it will come back and be printed sometime soon, I hope. A continuation of 2 other books. The first was The Languages of Jerusalem that I wrote with Bob Cooper. And then the second was The Languages of Israel that I wrote with Elana Shohamy. And the third one has the title The Languages of the Jews. Was when does the language of the Jews, whatever that means, become a Jewish language? And what is a Jewish language? These are some of the topics that I'll try and touch on. And these are some of the languages that are officially recognized as Jewish languages. We don't know as much about them as we should, and the particular gap that's sitting there waiting for you to go out and deal with is what is the present state. And somebody found me a student who claims to still have knowledge of Judeo-Aramaic, but he doesn't quite know how many people speak it. We don't know how many people speak most of these languages nowadays. That's another talk. We did have a social survey that deals with some of these languages in Israel, but it doesn't deal with most of them. So the question is, if you have access to any of these languages, get out there and find out how many people are still speaking them and what they're doing with them and what they think about them and why don't we speak it. All right, back to the question. Series of questions which sort of follow through historically. I'll try and follow through starting with the general question of what could a Jewish language be, and finish up with the intriguing question, is modern Israeli Hebrew, whatever you call it, a Jewish language? And there are very good reasons to say it is, and there are very good reasons to say it isn't. Let's start with Iyak. Now, Iyak I discovered when I was in New Mexico, because one of my students went off to Alaska to work with Michael Krauss. Iyak is related to Navajo. If you go back to Proto-Navajo and Proto-Iyak, the 2 languages appear to be related according to Krauss, and it could then be related, according to Sapir, to Chinese. Wow. So if you're looking for an argument that American Indian languages come from China, then Iyak is the language to work on. Well, the problem was when Mike Krauss got to Alaska, there were only 2 people left who still knew Iyak. 2 old ladies who hadn't spoken to each other for 40 years. They didn't like each other. They spoke other Indian languages, of course. So he learned the language. And when the last of the speakers died a few years ago, he was left as probably the only person who knows Iyak. And he's Jewish. So does that make Iyak a Jewish language? Because the only person who can speak it is Jewish. I don't think so. Anyway, that sort of gives you the basic issue. And in fact, I understand recently a student turned up from France who wanted to learn EAC, and so now there's probably a second speaker. They're also trying to work on some of the descendants of the EAC piece of the language. Okay, what we're going to be looking at historically are the development of these various languages and the questions that are raised about what are they and should they be considered Jewish languages, and what would be a Jewish language. And I always feel that it's better to start with data and then start building a theory rather than starting with a theory and data. So I'm not going to define a Jewish language at this point, except I've defined it negatively. It's not just a language spoken by Jews. There must be something more to it than that. And after we've looked at a few cases, we'll go into that. So the first historically to think about is, as far as we can tell, Hebrew developed in this area of the world when Abraham moved here, picked up one of the Canaanite dialects that everybody was speaking, or several of them, and after a while that developed into the language of the kingdom of David and Solomon, if they existed. It's complicated. Anyway, it appears everything was quite nice and straightforward. We had a single language state with everybody in it presumably speaking a particular variety of language that was related to the other languages around, sort of connected up to all the other languages of the Middle East, but was distinct. And everything went along peacefully until around about 586, before the Common Era, 2,500 years ago about, when a good proportion of the Jews who were living here were dragged off to Babylon. And when they got to Babylon, they started to pick up the local language, which was Aramaic. When they came back, which is only 70 years later, a group did come back, although a lot stayed there. The ones who came back, it's not quite clear what happened. The official view that turned up in the Talmud and was adopted by a lot of historical linguists, particularly non-Jewish ones, was that when they came back, they were already speaking Aramaic. It says somewhere, talking about Ezra, that Ezra started the practice of reading from the Torah once a week. And the reading was Mufurash. And the authorities say the Mufurash meant it was translated into Aramaic because nobody could understand Hebrew. That's the official story, 586. On the other hand, if you look closely at the text, Ezra complained bitterly. He said, when we came back, the people who hadn't been to Babylon couldn't speak Hebrew anymore. They'd married women from Ashdod. They were speaking half Ashdodis, he said, and they didn't know Hebrew. Now, if the Jews who came back were already speaking Aramaic, why did he care if they didn't know Hebrew? So the chances looked like the people who stayed behind started speaking Aramaic, and the people who came back from Babylon also picked up some Aramaic. And Aramaic slowly took over the area. There's a big argument about how long it took for Aramaic to replace Hebrew. One group says 586 BC. No, sorry, 516 BC. Right? And the other group, many of the Jewish scholars, like Rabin and so on, say about 300 of the Common Era. Now, that's a difference of 800 years. Which shows you part of the difficulty of what we're doing. When we're trying to recreate sociolinguistic history. The evidence is very thin, very slight. The main evidence we have is evidence of what people wrote at the time if there was writing. If there wasn't writing, it's very hard to do a history of a language. I was invited a few years ago to the Basque country, to the Basque Academy, to sit with them and discuss it. How do they do a history of Basque? And nobody was writing Basque until quite recently. So they were planning to do a history that we based on evidence of what people spoke. They heard a sermon given in Basque. They wrote this somewhere in a letter in French, and so on. So we're talking about a period during which Aramaic slowly took over a whole area and certainly became a language of the Jews. And ultimately, at the next stage, became a principal Jewish language in the writing of the Talmud. The Talmud Bavli is written mainly in Aramaic. And the ability to read Aramaic then became a mask of serious Jewish education. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So, by the time, let's say the time of the destruction of the temple, Jews living here were likely to be speaking both Aramaic and some were speaking Hebrew. That's the theory I go with. There was some hard evidence. They deal with that. They deal with that the same way as they deal with the Latin written in the Middle Ages. Priests wrote it. The rabbis wrote it in a language that was dead. They made up a language to write it. Okay? And it's only some of the scholars like Noam Chomsky's father, who was a distinguished scholar of Hebrew language, who argued that, no, this must have been the kind of Hebrew, the Mishnah must have been the kind of Hebrew that developed later. It's different from the Hebrew of the Tanakh, but it's a later development. So they argue that's the spoken variety. But other people argue, no, that was made up, it's a jargon, it's an artificial language, just as Latin was an artificial language when it was no longer spoken. But you see, again, this is an area where it's very hard to get a definite answer. You have to have an opinion at the end of looking at all the evidence. Okay, so anyway, what have we got so far? We've got Jews with a couple of languages, and fairly shortly after that, we have a third language introduced when Alexander conquered this part of the world, and the government became Greek-speaking. And once the government was Greek-speaking, we now have a situation where the languages of the Jews are threefold. There are three separate languages sitting around, being used in different ways. There are three separate languages sitting around, being used possibly in different parts of the country. There's sort of evidence that Hebrew held on, first of all in Judah, but later on in the Galil. Aramaic, certainly the most common language, the most common vernacular, the language in which probably most of the Jews who followed Jesus were using. Greek, being used for connections with the government. So therefore, if you had anything to do with the government, and if you were wealthy, and you wanted to have connections with the government, or if you wanted your daughter to be eligible for a good marriage, you made sure she knew Greek. So the three languages sat there. At the time of Jesus, there's good evidence that the three languages were all working at once. And this pattern of Jews having three languages with different functions. Mainly Hebrew was the language of the sacred text of the Tanakh. But already by now there's a good chance that Aramaic was being used, as it's still used by Yemenites, as a translation or interpretation after every verse. Right? Some people say a translation. The better explanation is it's an interpretation. And you had Greek. Some people even had permission. There was a shul in Jerusalem at the time of the first temple, the second temple, sorry, the time of the second temple, where Jews actually had permission to pray in Greek because they came from Egypt. They didn't know Hebrew well enough. So there would have been a lot of Jews in some of the cities like Caesarea, which is where the government was, who spoke Greek as well. You had these two other languages. Now, what's going on? What are these languages? We'll leave Hebrew alone. Is Aramaic the same as the Aramaic spoken in the rest of the area? And the answer is probably not. This was Aramaic being spoken with all sorts of differences, and certainly influenced by Hebrew, and influenced by knowledge of Hebrew. So it's already starting to develop as something distinct, as a distinct variety. And there's a good chance the Greek spoken by the Jews, and if not the Jews in Judea, certainly the Jews who moved into the areas Cyprus, Rhodes, Crete, Sicily, and up as far as Rome. The many Jews living there were probably speaking Greek, but a variety of Greek that was influenced by their Hebrew and influenced by their Aramaic. So by this time, this is actually the route of St. Paul going around preaching Christianity, but of course where did he go? He went to the Jewish communities, because they were people who he should talk to, although he spoke in Greek as well, that's probably Aramaic. And Jews were slowly moving in Cyrene, there was a community, and even Carthage was probably a Jewish community. At this stage speaking, mainly in Greek, with certain knowledge of Hebrew. We'll come back to that. Okay, so we start to define these two languages of the Jews, the Aramaic and the Greek, as different from the Aramaic and Greek spoken by others, non-Jews, and starting to take on some of the characteristics of Jewish languages, namely to include probably lots of words borrowed from Hebrew, and to modify the grammar in all sorts of interesting ways. Okay, the next big language that gets added to the pattern is Arabic. It's not a good map, because the map we want would show us, instead of going around here, which is this is the Islamic conquest, if we had a map that went down to here, and we had Arabia and Yemen on it, we would find an interesting development. By the time that Muhammad came onto the scene, there were large numbers of Jewish tribes in Arabia and Yemen. They're very important ones in Arabia because he tried to convince them to accept him as the Messiah. When they rejected him, he expelled them, essentially, from Arabia. But tribes continued, Jewish tribes continued in Yemen for quite some time. Now, who were these people? And what did they speak? It's not clear. We don't have any good evidence. You can take a theory that says traders went down and converted them to Judaism, or some of them, or many of them. Or you can take a theory as saying they just had something they liked about this idea of Judaism that appealed to them. The chances that the ones in Arabia at that stage knew very much Hebrew was very unlikely. But we know certainly in Yemen that the Jewish tribes of Yemen developed later into a very strong Jewish tradition with very deep knowledge of Hebrew. And the kind of Arabic they spoke was presumably influenced by that. And that kind of Yemenite Arabic would presumably count as a Jewish language. In the meantime, while this was going on in Arabia, Jews were moving all around the Mediterranean. After the destruction of the temple, large numbers of them were taken to Italy as slaves, and when they were freed there, you started building up a strong Jewish population in Italy. Others moved to all these other cities around this area, and some into further east into Persia, some even into Spain, certainly to North Africa. And those were the areas that, starting in the 8th century, you had the rapid conquest by Islam. Why it was so fast, the scholars debate. The best explanation is that most of these countries had suffered from pretty severe plagues, and there wasn't too much population left, so that quite small bands of soldiers, mainly Bedouin, could move in quite fast, and did. So within comparatively few years, this whole of North Africa, including Spain, and the whole of this part of the world had come under Islamic rule. Islamic rule also meant Arabization, but it took quite a while. Some areas, like Iraq, there were many Muslims came from Arabia, so that you had a presence of Arabic speakers. In many other parts of the world, and Persia is an obvious example, the older languages, Persian, Pahlavi, continued to be the main language of the people. But in many of these areas, and certainly in North Africa, and the Jews in North Africa up till this were probably speaking Greek, they switched to Arabic. And you start to have the development of a Jewish variety of Arabic in North Africa, certainly, and further east, if we move into Persia, the development of a Jewish variety of Persian. Exactly what it was like is hard to know. Generally, the best guess is that the Jews in Persia spoke the local dialect, but as an official language, they would have used the standard language. Okay, we've got Arabic now added to the picture. But Arabic, interestingly enough, replacing Aramaic. So we've still got the three languages in the pattern, or replacing Greek, not added to them after a while. Now, the rest of Jewish history consists of expulsions until we get up to the modern days. And it's just followed. First of all, with the Reconquista, it's called, Spain became Christian again, and they first of all got rid of their Muslims, and secondly they got rid of their Christians, their Jews. They moved them first of all into Portugal, but within a few years they were thrown out of Portugal as well. So the Jews from here moved back through North Africa, and a lot of them moved into the Balkan area. And they took with them the variety of Judeo-Latin that they had learned from the Visigoths, who had conquered Spain. Now, Spain was conquered by Visigoths who were Romanized, picked up Latin as their main language. So you had a period in Spain where you had Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew. An educated person would choose which of the languages to use. If we're talking about the year 1000, then the chances were good that many people would know several of those languages and use them in different ways. Jews at the period were writing, before the expulsion, were writing in all of the languages. After the expulsion, though, presumably the Spanish they were speaking was no longer the language where they went to. When the Jews from Spain got to, let's say, Salonika, they continued to speak a variety of Jewish Spanish, which started picking up lots of names. The one linguists prefer is Judesmo. The one that most people know is Ladino. People who speak it call it something else, like Spangliete and various other names. Right? And that became a major Jewish language with both spoken and written forms. Ladino was the written form in particular. A lot of Jewish literature was written in it. Judesmo was probably the spoken form. It comes back in all sorts of interesting ways as some of these people move back to Western Europe, and you start getting communities in Holland speaking Judesmo, and you start getting communities in France singing songs in Judesmo. But they had to rely very much on the teachers and rabbis from the East until they got really well established. And then the community from Amsterdam, of course, moved over to New Amsterdam, New York, and the start of Sephardi settlement of the Americas. Okay, so we've got Jews moving around. Italy was the only place they weren't regularly expelled from. Although the communities in the north were pretty small, they were larger and stronger in the south, and were closely related to the communities going further east. Where are we up to? Well, we were up to a new pattern. We'll go back to this one. We'll do it this way first. With the expulsion, these are the years of the last major expulsion. There were lots before, there were the pogroms before, there were the Crusades before, and so on. 1492 from Spain, 1497 from Portugal, 1490 from Provence, earlier 1306 from France, earlier 1290 from England, 1100s from Germany into parts of Poland, and so on. These communities moved, left, and took with them usually their language. And when they got to the new place, the first thing they tried to do, if they were allowed to, was to build a synagogue in which they would pray with people from the same place who knew their language and who followed the same customs. So you have a place like Venice in Italy, where they admitted, first of all, a few Ashkenazi Jews, let them stay overnight in the ghetto. And so they built a synagogue. And then, a little bit later, they let in some Sephardi Jews, and they built their own synagogue. And a little bit later, they came in some Jews from other parts of Italy. They built their own synagogue. So Venice, in that tiny ghetto, anybody who's been there will have seen the 4 synagogues, each one based on a different community. In the 16th century, when printing started, Venice was one of the centers of Jewish printing. There was a Haggadah printed with the text in Hebrew in one column, Yiddish in another column, Judaism Ladino in the 3rd column, and the 4th column, Judeo-Venetian, because there wasn't Italian yet. Each Italian city had its own dialect. And so the Jews of Venice spoke the local dialect, and their Haggadah therefore had a variety of Jewish Venetian in it. So now you have a very critical movement, a community that seems to have got settled, first of all, in the Rhineland, and then moved east from Germany into Slavic-speaking areas, where they met groups that came up from other places. Somehow there, Yiddish developed. Again, this is one of the things we don't have a clear answer to. There's a book, codex, called the Oxford Codex, published about 1206, written in 1206, that is written in Hebrew letters, and the language is mainly German. Some people say it's German, other people say it's Yiddish. It is, according to the Yiddishists, the first Yiddish book. According to the Germanists, there wasn't any Yiddish yet.
What year is it?
1206, I think. So we're talking about what's going on in a time when we don't have terribly clear evidence of what people were. Out of this movement, a new language developed, which was Yiddish. There are 3 reasonable theories and a 4th unreasonable. The established position, the one that we'll say Weinreich takes, is that Yiddish grew up in the Rhineland before the First Crusade, when Jews were mixing with the Gentile population happily. They picked up German, which they modified. How did that happen? The example that he gives fits one case I know. I'll take a moment to talk about Papua New Guinea. there's a village in Papua New Guinea where the language is Yap. It's a village, YAP. It's a village with a population of about 100. And the language they speak is unrelated to any other language that is known. The village is isolated. You have to get there through jungles and swamps and so on, which is how the language kept being spoken for so long and why it's so isolated. Right? It's one of these isolates, unrelated to any other language. Now, the first anthropologist to go there, I think it was a Swede, went there, and they were very interested. They'd never seen a white man before. And he stayed there for a while, and he studied the children. And he found the children were no longer speaking Yap. They were speaking Tok Pisin, the Creole language of New Guinea. Pidgin, right? And he wondered how that happened, and after a while he found out what happened. During the war, the Second World War, some young men from the village went away to work in the plantations. And they went away from the village, worked in plantations, and they picked up the very interesting belief there in the cargo that New Guineans really love. Things, Western things, whatever they were. And during the war, it was very impressive because sometimes they dropped out of the air, or they came off a ship. And so they came back with two things. They brought their little packs of cargo to show they'd been away from the village, maybe a knife or an axe or something like that. And they brought this variety of language, Pidgin. And they showed off their status by speaking it to each other. And the other people in the village were always very interested in language, and the women were going to let them get away with it. So they learned it too. They picked it up from these people. They all started speaking Pidgin. Now, there was another intriguing rule in this village, not uncommon in Polynesian countries. There's no point in talking to children because they don't understand. So you don't speak to babies. Oh, occasionally, right, when the baby is crying, you might pick it up and mumble something like, look at the little piggies running around the room. Of course, there aren't any little piggies running around the room, so the kids don't learn that language. So, occasionally, though, people would tell kids to do something. Come here, go and do the washing, go, whatever it is, look after your brother. But they would do that in Pidgin. So when this anthropologist got there, there was nobody in the village under the age of 13 who could speak Yap. None of the parents had noticed. They still didn't speak to the young ones. Now, what Weinreich suggests is, in these Jewish communities in the Rhineland, the men who went outside to do trading and to do business picked up the German being spoken by the villagers around there. And when they came back, they sat around speaking to each other, showing off the language. We noticed this in the study we did in the old city of Jerusalem, that you'd walk down the shuk, you'd hear a couple of Arab merchants speaking to each other in Hebrew. Yeah. To show that they knew that language. Right? This is well before we're talking about early on, before there was any other way to pick up the language in the street. So the suggestion is that in the Rhineland area, Jews picked up German and started speaking it. And then later on, when they were expelled from Germany and moved into the Slavic-speaking areas, the relationship with the Slavs were not so close, so they kept speaking. German, which became Yiddish. That's Weinreich's theory. That's theory one. Theory two is much like that, except it argues that if you look at Yiddish, the German base is not the German spoken in the Rhineland, but the German spoken in Bavaria, so that more likely this happened in Regensburg than in the Rhineland. And there's a third theory, which is it actually happened in Prague. And the Jews in Prague were speaking a variety of Slavic. There's evidence that there are glosses to Rashi there written in Old Czech. So there's good evidence that Jews knew Old Czech, the Slavic language. And the theory is they were speaking Old Czech, they were speaking Slav, when a lot of Bavarian farmers were moved into the area of Prague, Czechoslovakia, and these Bavarian farmers brought German with them, and the Jews picked up German from them, picked up Yiddish from them. So that's the third fairly reasonable theory. There's another theory, which is that the Khazars who were converted to Judaism in Kursler's theory moved across and all started speaking Yiddish. Or the Sorbians, that's another one, who were non-Jews, picked up the language and started speaking Yiddish. All right, anyway, what do we have now? We have a basic picture developing that you can generalize through this whole period. You have Jewish communities living in the diaspora with three languages. Hebrew-Aramaic, I'll divide them up in a minute. A Jewish language, whether it's Ladino, Judesmo, Judeo-Arabic, Yiddish, and the co-territorial non-Jewish variety, whether it's German, Spanish, Czech, Polish, or whatever. Okay? Who uses it? Who knows it? Well, basically, the Jewish community within the community use the Jewish variety. And you can assume that the women all spoke it, and the men all spoke it, and the children all learned it. When the children went to school, in Jewish education, they went to Cheder, they started learning, first of all, to read Hebrew. A few of them went on to study the Talmud and probably knew Aramaic as well. But the theory that seemed pretty reasonable is that within that community, people could read Hebrew letters, but they really didn't understand Hebrew terribly well. That's true of the women and probably most of the men. So in the West, when they started printing, they printed material written in the Jewish variety, and the Yiddish, in Hebrew letters. And that gave access to these materials to women and most of the men. Although the small intellectual group, the rabbis, were still writing in a kind of Hebrew-Aramaic of a higher level. And people who had connections outside, who were trading with Gentiles and so on, would pick up the local language, but not know it very well. Right? So this is a pattern that's probably true of a lot of the Jewish diaspora until we move into the next period. So, essentially, he's teaching them to read the Hebrew letters, and having taught them to read the Hebrew letters, they can read books written in Yiddish. Interesting enough, what were the books? in the West, in Western Yiddish, most of the books were adaptations of romances, stories of Arthur, stories of the knights, and so on, love stories, all sorts of things like that. It was only in the East, in Poland, that a new variety of written Yiddish developed that had religiously based texts. So that Western Yiddish, when it started as a literary language, was pretty heavily Gentile influenced, and it was Eastern Yiddish that became particularly adopted by the Hasidim of all groups, who took it most seriously and wrote strictly acceptable texts. Okay, it gets more complicated than that when we follow on, but that's sort of the basic story at that point. So, you had a situation where Hebrew, in many of these communities, or Hebrew-Aramaic, was the language of literacy. You could write your own vernacular in using those letters. You could write Judesno, or you could write whatever you liked, or Yiddish, using those letters. You'd have to be pretty well educated to have access to the serious texts of the language. But things developed. For example, women started writing poetry at this period. It was also interesting. The modern world. Suddenly, Jews are admitted. The French Revolution said Jews were allowed to be citizens. It took a few years to work it out. Napoleon thought it was a good idea. He set up a Sanhedrin. And these Jews living in France then came under the same provision that also came out of the French Revolution. French Revolution, the Jacobins passed a policy that went something like this. If you live in French territory, you have to speak French. Therefore, all the schools must do all their teaching in French. And all the Jewish children also must go to these schools and learn French. It took 100 years for that policy to work, because they couldn't find any teachers who knew French. People in France didn't speak French. What they called French was the language from around Paris, right? But people who spoke Occitan or any of these other varieties, Breton. Which one? Niçois being one of them, right? These were not recognized by the government.
That's right.
But the policy was they should be. that the people should be, not the language, right? So you started to have, going on in France, the beginning of emancipation, which also included assimilation, and very commonly apostasy, becoming Christian. And also switching to the co-territorial language, as Jews were admitted to schools that provided compulsory education. In Germany, the emancipation was a bit later, but there was an earlier movement within the Jews under Joseph Mendelssohn, arguing for using not Yiddish, not jargon, not that terrible language from the East. We should write, we should speak German. And that was picked up, and the German Jews who were there started switching from Yiddish to German. In England, the Jews who came there, and they come actually at the time of Cromwell, they survived somehow during the period of Dickens. You read about what Jews, what happened to them in Dickens. unless they made it, like Disraeli, who converted Christianity. His father converted, and he became prime minister. And he didn't give up being consciously Jewish, but Christian in public at least, right? The Jews of England also slowly switched to English, to the local language. If it hadn't been for the continued number of Jews coming from the east, the Ostjuden, who came west and went all the way to America as well, particularly after the pogroms of 1882, you wouldn't have had Jewish languages there. Everybody would have switched to the local language. We left them alone. And in most of these areas, that seems to be what happened. Now, at this stage, then, we have the remains of Jewish languages where there is not emancipation. You see, there was never emancipation in South Africa. Although under the French, there was a chance to join the French school system. And the Jews picked that up very fast. The Jews and the Christians switched from Arabic to French. But, and the same also in Russia, until the revolution, things were fairly slow. Okay, at this stage, we have the part of history you all know about. The recreation of Jewish nationalism based on taking the three-part design. Nationalism in Europe was defined as having a people, a land, and a language. Well, the Jews who went back to Israel had a people, but they didn't have a land or a language yet, and the language was the easiest thing to do something about. The land took somewhat longer. And so you have, and we'll have to talk about what that means. And you had these strong people arguing for Jewish nationalism and the use of Hebrew, and running around and complaining that Bialik was speaking Hebrew to that, speaking Yiddish to a woman in the street. And he said, "But it's my wife, that's why And they said, "We don't care. In public, only Hebrew." Okay. And these were the kids from the high schools who were leading in the Judeo-Aramaic all through the 1920s and 30s. That was picked up later on, established. All right, now let's move on to the problem of Hebrew. How do we deal with modern Hebrew? See, if all we want are these people, it's pretty easy. Right? They were Jewish, they spoke a language that was quite changed from the language of the Bible, and even from the language of the Mishnah, and even from the language of the Middle Ages, and even from the language of the 19th century. A little bit closer to the Hebrew spoken written in the 19th century, but quite different. And so we wouldn't have too much trouble in saying this is probably a Jewish language. But what happens now that Hebrew is spoken by Palestinians and by foreign workers? How do we fit it into that definition? I'm not going to answer the question. I just ask questions. Okay? I've got a sort of an answer. Or let me give you another question. How do we deal with the Jews of Africa? We go back to... Where's the map? Do we have a map that goes back there? No, we don't have a map that takes us down. We want to go down here, right? We want to go down to Arabia. And what happened is that various groups obviously in Ethiopia, the Beta Israel, and also in Nigeria, and the Igbo and the Yoruba, or the United States, the black Jews, all came along and said, yeah, we're Jews too. And we're descended from Queen of Sheba, or the Jews who were expelled, the lost tribes. Why don't you count us? And what happens when we try to count them? What do we do with their language? Do we say Amharic is a Jewish language? Do we say Tigrinya is? And certainly, what about Hebrew? The first missionaries said Hebrew. Oh, it sounds like Hebrew. And some of them took out with them documents written in Hebrew to try and see if the people were speaking their language. And some of the Jews of Africa liked the idea. And they said, good, sounds good, we'll be Jewish too. Well, the only ones who recognize so far, of course, are the Beta Israel. The Beta Israel, the evidence is quite difficult. There is a theory that they were converted to Judaism by Jewish traders. Quite early. A better theory seems to suggest they were converted to Christianity and they dropped some of the ideas of Christianity and became Jewish. And when they were discovered, essentially in the 19th century, they persuaded people they were Jewish and we accepted them. At least, you know, the rabbis accepted them and the state accepts them. Okay, so if they did, would we have to count their language? Would you want to count their language? What about English? Is there a Jewish variety of English? You've heard it. Some of you probably speak it. There's a very good study by Benor, just out. What it is a study not so much of the variety, but of the way in which people becoming newly religious adopt Hebrew Yiddish terms in their English and change their English to build up their identity. Other people say, no, there really is a Jewish variety of English, where you call it yeshivish or frumspeak or what. Good question. But try another question. What about modern Israeli Hebrew? Is it a Jewish language? Well, is it different? And clearly it's very different from the older versions of Hebrew. It may be a continuation, but nobody was speaking it actively for a couple of thousand years. It was being written, it was being used, but it wasn't being spoken. Do we talk about what we still call English, even though it's quite different from Old English and Middle English? So why shouldn't we think of Hebrew as a continuation? That's one of the questions. Secondly is obviously the question that if we have non-Jewish speakers in good numbers, as we obviously do, then how can it still stay a Jewish language? Or if it has become, as I'm sure you've heard, a majority language, a language of the state, a standard language, a hegemonic language, a dominant language, how can it fit the definition of most Jewish languages, which are minority languages? There's actually an answer to that question.
Yeah.
We're surrounded, first of all, if you'd like to take the big one, we're just one little language in this whole world. Or if you just take the Middle East, we're one little language surrounded by Arabic. So we can still argue that modern Hebrew is a minority language, even though it's the dominant language within the state boundaries. I don't know. Leave that as a question. All right, back to the list. They're all very interesting. Most of them we don't know much about where they're up to. I had a student who took home the book on Judeo-Aramaic as a Bar-Ilan and came back and said, that's what my parents speak. They didn't know it was a language. Because he doesn't know it. There's said to be a Jewish variety of Dutch. Somebody claims to know some of the words that his parents know from Judeo-Aramaic. Is there a Jewish variety of Russian? Certainly we know about Judeo-Arabic, but how many people still use it?
Many of them. Quite a few, though.
That's the question. And how many of their children still use it? That's the question, right? The Jewish varieties of Italian, more or less faded. Although somebody I met in Venice claims to know Venetian still. And in Rome, well, the main Jewish language nowadays in Rome is spoken by the Libyans, who take it as a Judeo-Persian. The people in the United States that have asked about it say we don't speak Judeo-Persian. There was one, but we speak Persian. We spoke, when we were in Persia, we spoke the local dialects. Judismo is the language that one of my colleagues says has more names than speakers. It's not altogether fair, but still. Yiddish is alive and well in the Hasidic communities, particularly outside Israel. But it refuses to have anything to do with the Yiddish literature of the 19th century, because that's secular. The people who collect the books written in Yiddish somewhere in Massachusetts, they collect the books and they probably go to Yiddish classes once a month. And they like Yiddish very much, but they don't speak it. Yiddish now is like the other languages, I suspect. The speakers are getting old. And the same with most of these languages, of which we have very little evidence. Well, I've given you some facts. I've given you a couple of theories, which I'm not pushing too hard. There are a huge number of questions in this field. So it's been fun to me to study it because I've learned a huge amount that I didn't know about. I mean, it blew my mind, as they say, when I discovered the Jewish tribes of Arabia. the numbers of a dozen at least. The puzzles that are left are very good ones. And if any of you have time, go out and study it.